Rancher lived alone for years until he saved a frozen Bigfoot child outside his home. The storm had passed, but the silence that followed was worse. Out there, beyond the pines, something was crying. Not human, not animal, just lost. Matthew George had lived alone for years, and still that sound broke through his heart like a crack in the ice. When he found it half buried in snow, barely breathing, he didn't think he just moved. He carried the frozen child inside, wrapped it in blankets, fed the fire like a prayer. But outside the forest didn't sleep. Eyes watched. Branches creaked. The clan was waiting. What followed was no fight. It was a moment of grace, between man and myth, between fear and compassion, because sometimes saving a life saves your own. Before we begin, take a moment to comment the name of your city. Where are you watching from tonight? And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oregon winter of 1978. The storm had passed, but the forest wasn't quiet, not truly. The pines stood heavy with snow, their branches bending under the weight of the wind. And in that silence, something broke through a cry, faint, thin, and trembling. Not a man's voice, not an animal's either, but something in between. Matthew George, 58. A retired soldier turned recluse sat by his fire when he heard it. He'd spent years alone in this wilderness, chasing quiet, but this sound cut right through it. Lantern in hand, he stepped out into the white dark, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The wind howled through the trees, carrying that same desperate cry, closer, now weaker. His pulse quickened. Instinct told him to turn back. Compassion said otherwise. And then he saw it. Half buried near the tree line was a small, dark shape. Matthew brushed away the snow and froze. It wasn't a bear cub. It wasn't human. The creature's face was soft beneath the frost, its chest barely rising. Tiny hands curled in the cold eyes, half shut as if pleading for warmth. For a long moment, Matthew just stared, every instinct at war inside him. Then, with a trembling breath, he whispered, "Not tonight. Not like this." He pulled the small body close, wrapping it in his coat as the storm began to rise again. And as he turned back toward the cabin, one thought echoed in his mind. He might have just brought something impossible back to life. Part 1. The man who feared no war but feared being alone. The morning light crept through the frost-covered window of the cabin, painting pale streaks across the wooden floor. Smoke curled lazily from the dying fire, and the faint sound of an old clock ticked in the silence. Matthew George sat at the small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee gone cold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet so deep it almost rang in his ears. On the wall beside him hung an old photograph, a young woman smiling in summer light. Her hair pinned neatly, her eyes soft. Beneath it, a dusty medal gleamed faintly, a relic from another life. A life of war, of noise, of orders shouted, and men falling. Now all that was left was the stillness. Scout, his old hound, stirred near the fire, letting out a low, sleepy groan. Matthew glanced at him and managed a small smile. "Morning, partner," he muttered. The dog thumped its tail once, as if acknowledging him before drifting back into dreams. He didn't speak much these days. There wasn't anyone to listen, not really. The forest didn't answer back. The walls didn't care. Only the fire crackled in response when he spoke. Years of solitude had taught him that silence could be both a friend and an enemy, a comfort when you sought peace, and a punishment when you sought meaning. But last night, something had broken that silence. The memory of it clung to him now, the sound, the cry, the shape in the snow. He had carried the small body inside, set it near the fire, and watched the faintest flicker of life return. The creature had barely moved, but it had breathed. That was enough. It was still alive when he fell into uneasy sleep near dawn. Now, in the gray light of morning, Matthew turned toward the cot near the hearth. The blankets were still piled there, motionless, except for the steady rise and fall of breath. The small Bigfoot child was still alive. He rose slowly, joints stiff from years of hard labor and cold mornings. He crouched near the cot, studying the creature. Its fur was matted and dark, the face oddly familiar. Not human, but not alien either. Its hands, though larger than a child's, had the same fragile tremor of weakness he had seen in soldiers after battle. Matthew sighed. "You're a tough one," he said quietly. "Guess you don't give up easy." Scout lifted his head, sniffed the air, and gave a faint whine. Matthew reached down, scratching behind his ear. "It's all right, boy. He's not going to hurt us." But even as he said it, doubt crawled through him. He didn't know what this thing was, not really. He'd heard stories like every man in Oregon had, tales of hairy giants in the mountains, wild men that lived beyond the reach of civilization. Hunters swore they'd seen tracks as wide as frying pans. Others claimed to hear cries in the fog. But no one had ever found one like this. And yet here it was, breathing softly in his home. He poured more coffee, though he didn't drink it. His thoughts drifted back to the war, to the mud and the screams, to faces that blurred into one endless night. He remembered the men he couldn't pull from the line of fire, the hands that slipped from his grasp. The guilt had followed him home long after the medals lost their shine. He stared at the creature again, its small chest rising and falling. Something stirred in him, something he hadn't felt in years. A need to protect, to redeem. He whispered to himself, voice rough from disuse, "I couldn't save them then. Maybe I can now." The words hung in the air, soft but heavy. Scout tilted his head, watching him. The old dog seemed to understand. Matthew set down his mug and began to move. He added wood to the fire, fed it, until the flames glowed warm and steady. He fetched clean water from the barrel and placed a bowl near the cot. The child stirred at the scent, eyes fluttering open just for a moment. Two dark eyes met his, uncertain, afraid, but aware. He froze. The stare wasn't that of an animal. It was intelligent questioning, the same look he'd seen in dying men who weren't ready to go. Matthew swallowed hard. "Easy," he murmured. "You're safe here." The creature blinked slowly, then closed its eyes again. Its breathing steadied. The fire cracked softly in the silence. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, and snow began to fall again, thin and lazy. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than it had in years. Matthew sat back in his chair, staring at the flames. His mind wandered not to fear, not to curiosity, but to something deeper. For the first time in a long while, his solitude felt different. Not broken, but shared. He reached for his old journal on the table, the one with pages half filled from winters past. He flipped to a blank page and wrote slowly, his handwriting rough and uneven. "Found something tonight. Not sure what it is. Small, covered in fur. Looks like a child. Alive. Hurt. I'll keep the fire going." He stared at the words, then underlined the last sentence. "I'll keep the fire going." Scout shifted again by the hearth, and Matthew leaned back, eyes heavy. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd spoken to anyone, since he'd cared for something beyond himself. Now, as the firelight flickered across the small form wrapped in blankets, he felt a strange peace settle in his chest. He didn't know what the forest would bring when night fell again, whether danger, mystery, or something worse. But for now, there was only warmth, breath, and quiet. And that was enough. Outside, the storm rebuilt its strength, whispering through the trees. Inside, an old man and a dying myth shared the same fragile fire, each keeping the other alive. Part 2. The Fire of Life. The storm outside beat against the cabin walls, but inside the fire roared steady and warm. Matthew crouched near the hearth, his hands trembling as he pulled another wool blanket over the small creature. The air smelled of smoke pine and melted snow. His breath fogged in front of him as he watched for movement, any movement at all. The childlike figure lay curled on the floorboards, wrapped in every blanket he owned. Its fur was thick but frozen stiff in patches. Matthew could still see ice clinging to the tips. He leaned closer, checking for breath. For a moment he feared it had stopped. Then faint, shallow, almost invisible, the chest rose. He let out the air he hadn't realized he was holding. "Come on, little one," he muttered. "Don't quit on me now." He stirred the fire, feeding it pine logs until sparks leapt high into the dark cabin ceiling. The flames glowed orange against the wood walls, casting the creature's shadow long across the floor. Scout, his old hound, watched from the corner, ears tilted forward, but silent. Even the dog seemed to understand this wasn't prey or threat. It was something else entirely. Matthew fetched a small basin of water from the stove and dipped a rag inside. He wrung it out, then gently wiped the frost from the creature's face. The fur gave way to rough skin underneath, soft around the eyes, the nose, flat, the lips, faintly bluish. It wasn't human, but it wasn't far from it either. "Jesus," he whispered under his breath. "What are you?" The creature stirred at the sound of his voice, a faint twitch running through its fingers. Its breathing deepened, slow but steady. Matthew froze, rag halfway in the air. He could hear the tiny inhale and exhale like the ticking of a fragile clock. Then came a sound, faint and broken like a low hum. The creature's throat moved, but no words formed. It wasn't a cry of fear. It was life returning. Matthew smiled despite himself. "That's it," he whispered. "That's it, keep breathing." He knelt beside it for hours, watching the slow rise and fall of its chest. Time slipped away, the storm outside, the creak of the roof, the groan of the trees, none of it mattered. Every fiber of his attention was locked on that small form beside the fire. At some point he realized his own hands were shaking. He held them close to the flame, not because he was cold, but because of what he felt inside. Something he hadn't felt in decades: responsibility, purpose, maybe even hope. Scout padded closer, sniffing the creature's fur. Matthew gave him a soft pat. "Careful, boy. We don't want to scare him." He sat back, his joints cracking as he leaned against the wall. He looked at the creature again, smaller than he remembered from the snow, no taller than a child of 8 or 9, but heavier, built solid under the fur. He'd carried it through the storm with every ounce of strength left in him. Now, looking at it in the firelight, he realized how close it had been to death. He reached for his old canteen, poured a little water into a tin cup, and held it near the creature's mouth. At first there was no response. Then slowly the small head turned the nose, twitching at the scent of warmth. Tiny fingers shifted beneath the blanket. One arm, longer than a human's, rose unsteadily and reached for the cup. Matthew's heart pounded. "Easy there," he said softly. He guided the cup closer. The creature's lips parted, and it drank, clumsy, spilling most of it onto the blanket, but still drinking. When it finished, it lay back again, chest heaving, as though the act itself had drained all remaining strength. But when its eyes opened, the world stopped. Two dark eyes, deep as the forest itself, blinked up at him. They were wide, uncertain, but not empty. In that moment, Matthew felt something shift inside him, a quiet understanding that whatever this thing was, it knew. It understood safety, pain, maybe even gratitude. He whispered again, voice trembling, "Easy there. You're safe now." The creature blinked once more, its gaze softening. Then it made a faint sound, half hum, half sigh, before closing its eyes again. The firelight flickered across its face, casting shadows that danced like breath. Matthew stayed kneeling beside it too, moved to speak, too afraid to break the fragile peace. The cabin was silent except for the gentle crackle of burning logs and the soft rhythm of two living beings breathing in sync, one man, one legend. He remembered the faces of the men he'd lost long ago, their eyes when they looked at him for help that never came. And now here was another pair of eyes, strange, alien, but pleading just the same. Only this time he could do something. He had done something. Outside, the storm faded into the distance. The wind no longer howled. It whispered. The trees, heavy with snow, stood like silent sentinels watching over them. Matthew sat back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him. His clothes were still damp, his hands raw, but he felt something warm spreading through his chest, not from the fire, but from within. He poured himself another cup of coffee and watched the flames dance. The small creature stirred again, curling slightly closer to the warmth. For the first time in years, Matthew smiled, a real quiet smile that reached his eyes. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "You hang on, little one. We'll figure this out come morning." Scout sighed beside him, head resting on his paws. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling upward. And there in that tiny cabin, lost in the frozen Oregon woods, two lonely souls. One human, one myth shared the same fragile spark of life. Outside, the snow fell slow and silent. Inside, the fire burned steady, a promise that, at least for tonight, no one would freeze alone. Part 3. The Eyes in the Dark. The second night came heavy and still. The storm had passed, but the silence that followed was deeper and unnatural. Even the forest seemed to be holding its breath. No owls, no wolves, not even the whisper of wind through the pine needles. Matthew sat in his chair beside the fire, a half-burned log crackling in the hearth. The creature the child lay curled beneath the blanket, its small chest rising and falling steady now. Scout, his old hound, slept beside it, tail twitching in restless dreams. Everything looked calm, peaceful. But something felt wrong. The air had changed. He noticed it first in the way Scout's ears lifted, the way his breathing shifted from deep and slow to short alert huffs. Then came the faint crunch snow just outside the cabin walls. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Matthew froze. Every instinct from his soldiering years came back at once. He set down his coffee hand, slipping quietly toward the shotgun leaning against the wall. Crunch, pause, crunch. It wasn't one set of steps. It was several, moving with weight but not with panic. He could hear them circling, their rhythm too, even to be human. Scout stood now, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. The child stirred under the blanket, eyes flickering open. For a brief moment, those dark eyes met his again, full of awareness and fear. Matthew's pulse quickened. "Easy, Scout," he whispered. "Stay close." Then it came, a sound unlike anything he had ever heard. A long, low whistle, not like wind, not like any animal call. It rose and fell steady, haunting, and filled the air like something ancient. The child stiffened. Its small head turned toward the window, listening. Then to Matthew's shock, it answered. A soft hum escaped its throat, short, broken, but clearly deliberate. And then more footsteps, closer this time. Snow shifting, branches brushing. Someone's were out there circling the cabin. Matthew rose to his feet, shotgun in hand, and moved toward the window. He wiped the frost from the glass with his sleeve. What he saw made the blood drain from his face. Eyes, dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness beyond the tree line. Low, high, near far, pairs of shimmering amber eyes fixed directly on his cabin. The firelight from inside caught them like reflections on water. They weren't random animals. They were watching, studying. He whispered under his breath, "You're not alone, are you?" His words hung in the air, barely audible, but the child turned its head toward him as if understanding. For the first time, Matthew realized he wasn't alone either. The forest, once his empty companion, was full of life tonight. Hidden, silent, ancient life. The cabin felt smaller now, the air thicker. Every instinct screamed danger, yet something else, something quieter, told him not to move, not to threaten. He backed away from the window, slowly lowering the shotgun. "We're not gonna fight," he murmured. "Not tonight." Outside, another whistle sounded deeper, more commanding. A response. Then, as quickly as it came, the night went still again. The eyes blinked once, twice, then faded one by one into the dark. Matthew waited, heart hammering, until the last glimmer vanished. Then he exhaled for the first time in what felt like minutes. He turned toward the fire. The child was awake now, sitting up slightly, blanket slipping from its shoulders. Its eyes dark, wet, almost human, locked onto his. Matthew knelt beside it. "They're your family, aren't they?" he said softly. The creature made a faint, throaty sound, not quite a yes, but not a denial either. Scout inched closer, sniffing the air, then rested his head on Matthew's leg. The room fell silent, except for the faint crackle of burning wood. In that stillness, Matthew felt something shift. The fear that had gripped him minutes ago melted into something else, understanding. They weren't here to attack. They were here to see, to make sure their young one was safe. He set the shotgun aside, the metal clanking softly against the floor. Then, almost without thinking, he reached into the firewood pile and added another log. The flames leapt higher, their glow spilling across the cabin floor and bleeding through the frosted windows, a signal, intentional or not, of warmth and peace. Outside, somewhere deep in the woods, an echoing whistle responded. Lower, slower, calmer. Matthew smiled faintly, his breath catching in his throat. Yeah, he whispered, voice trembling with something between awe and relief. I get it now. He turned to the child who had inched closer to the fire again. It blinked slowly, eyelids heavy with exhaustion, but body no longer trembling from cold. Matthew covered it again with the blanket and sat back in his chair. Scout curled up at his feet. And for the first time in years, Matthew felt a strange peace, not the peace of solitude, but of connection. Outside in the distance, the wind began to move through the pines again, gentle and rhythmic, almost like breathing. He glanced once more toward the window. The eyes were gone, but he could still feel them out there watching, understanding. He wasn't afraid anymore. He whispered mostly to himself, "You're not alone, are you?" Then after a pause, his voice softened, "Neither am I." The fire crackled, the forest exhaled, and in that fragile moment between fear and faith, man and myth shared the same heartbeat. Part 4. The Return to the Clan. The night was painted in silver. The storm had passed days ago, but the world was still frozen, blanketed in soft snow that glimmered beneath the moonlight. The forest stood motionless, not a sound, not a whisper, as though it too was waiting. Matthew stood at the edge of his cabin, his breath curling in the cold air. The small creature rested in his arms, wrapped in a wool blanket, its warmth faint but steady. It no longer trembled. Its breathing was calm, its weight now familiar against his chest. Scout padded beside him, paws sinking softly into the snow. The old dog didn't bark. He simply followed, quiet, solemn, sensing what was about to happen. Matthew stopped where the clearing met the tree line. The same forest that had once terrified him now looked alive. The moon filtered through the pines, turning the ground to a sea of silver frost. The air was sharp but gentle, the kind that makes a man remember he's alive. He looked down at the child, the little Bigfoot. Its eyes were open, reflecting the moonlight. There was no fear there anymore, only recognition. "This is it, huh?" he murmured, voice barely more than a breath. "You're home." He took one slow step forward, boots creaking in the snow, then another. And that's when the sound came. A deep, resonant hum, low, rolling, and ancient, echoing through the trees. It wasn't threatening, it was calling. Matthew froze. His grip tightened slightly around the child, more out of instinct than fear. He turned toward the sound, scanning the darkness between the trunks. Something moved. A massive shadow stepped from the forest's edge. Then another. And then from the darkness emerged the figure, towering broad, covered in thick fur that shimmered beneath the moonlight. A full-grown Bigfoot. Its size was almost unreal, its silhouette commanding, primal, yet its movements were calm, deliberate. Its eyes caught the light, glowing faintly amber. They didn't burn with rage or hunger. They held something far deeper. Understanding. The creature stopped a few paces away, lowering its head slightly as if acknowledging him. Matthew didn't move. He stood his ground, heart pounding, not from fear, but awe. "You came for your kid," he whispered, voice breaking slightly. "Guess I can't blame you." The young one stirred, lifting its small head. The soft sound it made, a mix between a whimper and a chirp, was unmistakably relieved. Matthew crouched down, setting the child gently onto the snow. It hesitated for a second, glancing back at him. Its hand, larger now but still small, brushed against his sleeve. He swallowed hard. "Go on, little one. You made it." The words came out rough, cracked at the edges. The child turned and stepped forward, its small footprints marking a trail across the snow. The adult waited still as stone. When the little one reached it, the massive creature bent down, one long arm wrapping protectively around it. The child pressed into its chest, safe at last. For a moment the world seemed to stop. The adult Bigfoot lifted its gaze toward Matthew. Their eyes met, two beings from different worlds, bound by a single act of mercy. No words were spoken, no sound exchanged. But the silence between them said everything. Matthew felt something rise in his throat, not fear, not pride, but something softer, purer, gratitude. The creature gave a slow, deliberate nod, small but heavy with meaning. Then it turned, taking the child's hand in its massive fingers, leading it back toward the shadows. The snow crunched softly beneath their feet. Just before they disappeared into the dark, the little one turned back. It looked at him long enough for Matthew to see the faint glint of reflection in its eyes and let out a sound. Soft, melodic, almost like a hum. It was the same tone it had made when it first woke beside his fire, only now it was stronger, clearer. A goodbye. Matthew stood there long after they vanished. The moon hung high above him, silver light spilling across the empty clearing. His breath came slow, his chest tight with something he couldn't quite name. Scout leaned against his leg, letting out a soft whine. "I know," Matthew said, running a hand through the dog's fur. "They're gone." He glanced down at the snow, the tiny footprints fading beside the massive ones, disappearing together into the forest. For a moment he wondered if anyone would ever believe him. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the warmth still burning in his chest, the same warmth that had saved a life that had bridged the space between man and myth. He turned back toward the cabin, his voice barely more than a whisper carried on the wind. "Good night, little one." As he walked away, the forest stirred one last time, a faint low hum rising through the pines like an echo of thanks from somewhere deep and unseen. Matthew paused, smiled and nodded toward the trees. Then, under the quiet silver light of the moon, the man who had once feared being alone finally understood he never truly was. Part 5. The Signs of Gratitude. The snow melted slow that spring, like the forest was waking from a long, careful sleep. Streams whispered again through the moss, and the scent of pine and wet earth returned to the air. The world, once white and lifeless, was green again, gentle, alive, reborn. Matthew stood on his porch, the old wood creaking beneath his boots. He leaned against the rail, a mug of coffee steaming in his hand, eyes scanning the edge of the clearing. Scout dozed beside him, nose twitching ears, flicking at the quiet buzz of morning insects. It had been weeks since that night under the moon, the night he'd returned the child to its family. No eyes had glowed in the forest since. No whistles in the dark, no movement beyond the trees. Just quiet. Almost too quiet. He had almost convinced himself it had all been a dream. One of those things a lonely man's mind invents when winter nights stretch too long. Until that morning. He noticed it the moment he stepped outside. At the edge of the yard, half buried in the soft spring soil, something waited. A deer. Small. Young. Perfectly still. For a moment Matthew's stomach tightened. Predator kill, he thought. But as he walked closer, the truth stopped him cold. The deer wasn't torn apart. It wasn't eaten. It was placed. Its body lay in perfect stillness, eyes closed as though asleep. There were no wounds, no blood. Just peace. He knelt beside it, the damp ground soaking through his knees. He ran a hand across its coat, still warm from the early sun. It had been left here. Intentionally. Scout stood beside him, whining low in his throat. Matthew looked around the tree line. The wind stirred the leaves softly, carrying the faintest scent of rain. No movement, no sound. Just the forest, vast and patient, watching. They remember. He whispered the words, slipping out before he could stop them. He stayed there for a long time, kneeling beside the offering, if that's what it was. When he finally rose, something inside him felt different. The loneliness that had always haunted his days seemed lighter, distant, like fog lifting from a field. The next morning it happened again. This time it was a pile of fish, clean, fresh, laid neatly by the front steps. He stared at them, half in disbelief, half in awe. He hadn't been to the river in weeks. The forest was speaking. Days later, another sign, a ring of branches carefully bent and arranged into a perfect circle near the cabin wall. Scout barked once, then quieted, tail wagging softly. Matthew didn't move the branches. He left them where they were. "They remember," he said again, his voice softer this time. Each small sign carried a quiet message, one not written in words but in the old language of nature, the kind that only a heart willing to listen could hear. He spent his evenings sitting on the porch watching the sun fall behind the pines. The air smelled of smoke and new grass. Sometimes when the wind shifted, he swore he could hear faint distant whistles echoing through the hills. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it wasn't. Whatever it was, it didn't frighten him anymore. He had seen the truth of the forest, that it wasn't wild against man, but wild beside him. That even the creatures of myth could understand something as simple as sacred as gratitude. One evening, as the sky turned gold, Matthew found himself smiling without knowing why. His reflection glimmered faintly in the window, older, yes, more worn, but not hollow. Scout barked once at the tree-line, tail wagging. Matthew followed his gaze and thought for just a second he saw movement, a dark shape slipping silently through the pines. It didn't linger. It didn't need to. He raised his hand in quiet salute, the same way soldiers do when words aren't enough. "Take care, little one," he murmured. "And thank you." The forest answered not with sound, but with silence, warm, alive, and full. As the last of the sun vanished beyond the ridge, Matthew sat back down on his porch. The coffee was cold now, but he didn't mind. His eyes softened lines, easing around them. He whispered once more, almost to himself, "They remember." And for the first time in years, the man who had feared being alone no longer was. Because somewhere in the deep Oregon woods, hearts still beat in rhythm with his own man and legend, bound forever by one act of kindness. Years passed, and the forest reclaimed its quiet. Seasons came and went, painting the land in gold, white, and green. Matthew grew old slower, in step softer, in voice, but his eyes still carried the same calm light. Each autumn before the first frost, he sat on his porch with Scout at his feet. A folded blanket rested beside a wooden bucket of water. A small oil lamp burned gently, its glow trembling in the dusk. His voice, low and steady, broke the silence. Every fall, before the first frost, I leave a blanket, a bucket of water, and a light for a friend. From deep within the trees, a faint knock echoed once, twice, soft as memory. Matthew didn't turn his head. He only smiled. "Welcome home," he whispered. The firelight shimmered on his weathered face as the forest seemed to breathe around him, alive, ancient, and kind. In the Wild West, kindness is the only fire that never dies. Bigfoot was never a monster, only the reflection of our own humanity. If this story touched your heart, leave a little fire emoji in the comments so we'll know the kindness in you is still burning. This is Rancher Wild West Stories, where every lonely night in the West hides a story that might save a soul.